I am Karl Franz, and I was born into this world, just like you. A world of unceasing war and endless terrors. But with a nation of men at its heart, a bastion of hope and courage. The Empire. Led by the craven, torn apart by the greedy, weakened and exposed, forever on the defense. But no longer.
Heroes are the heart of stories. They're the ones we look up to, the ones we root for, the ones who slay the dragon and fell the ancient evil. Today we're going to talk about writing heroes and do a character study on one of the best examples of a hero, Karl Franz, from Warhammer Fantasy, who is both prince and emperor, who summons the elector counts. If you know him, you love him, and if you don't know him, you're going to. We're going to structure this video into 4 parts based on the 4 attributes that all classic heroes must have in order to earn that title, and how our boy Karl embodies them part and parcel. Without further ado, the first of those is Part 1, Hero as Brave. Not all heroes have to start brave. In fact, it can be even better if they start out cowardly, afraid, and hesitant to step forward into the world of dangers and perils that they're thrust into. And yet, at the end of the day, even if their teeth are chattering, their heart is pounding, and every part of them is screaming at them to run away, they will still face the evil that lies before them. It's said often, and I much agree, that bravery does not mean that you don't feel fear. That's just foolishness. Bravery is feeling that fear and pressing on anyway, because you know you have to face up to whatever it is that scares you. There probably isn't a culture in the world that doesn't honor bravery in some respect. While the exact definitions and levels to which the other 3 attributes I'll talk about may vary, bravery is a near universal quality of heroes. It's a simple one too, at the outset anyway. It's mechanically required for a story to work. I mean, if a character cowers and runs away, the story doesn't happen. And yet it can be one of the most absolutely deep of all heroic traits. And that's because bravery has to come from somewhere. Bravery has to be a result of some sort of conviction. Maybe it's a conviction to sacrifice oneself so that others may live, a conviction to cast down evil, one to right past wrongs. That conviction, whatever it is that allows your heroes to press forward, is something that will be unique to them in some way, and that will define their journey. Now is when we talk about Karl Franz himself. But before we do that, let me tell you who exactly Karl Franz is if you don't know. His full name is Emperor Karl Franz I of the Holzwig-Schlestein dynasty, and he is the current sitting emperor of the Empire in Warhammer Fantasy. He governs a Holy Roman Empire-like state, made up of several provinces with squabbling counts and dukes below him. But unlike many conventional noble characters in fantasy, he wasn't just the lucky guy who happened to be born in the right place to be selected as heir. He actually has to be elected to become emperor, and by that court of squabbling nobles. In fact, this election even takes place mere weeks after his father dies. He's 32 at this time, give or take, and not only is he not the current likely candidate to become the next emperor, he isn't even in the running by his own choice. He thinks he's too young and inexperienced to take on the role. And yet, through demonstrating the characteristics of the hero, he ends up not only convincing the other electors, including his chief rival, Boris Todbringer, that he should, in fact, become emperor, but he even convinces himself that he's up to the task. Now, of course, we move on to his being a hero in terms of bravery and how that bravery is tied to his sense of duty. You might expect I would reference one of the many times he's ended up in a fight that's nearly got him killed. Fighting fanatical spider-riding goblins, being nearly killed by assassins many times, or otherwise fighting in countless bouts against orcs, chaos, undead, you name it. But I'd say one of the best examples of his bravery would be in something that has nothing to do with combat at all. And that would be during one of the darkest moments before his election as emperor. You see, in the nation he lives in, there are 2 politically dominant faiths. That of Sigmar, the war god who lived life as a mortal, united the Unborogan tribes, then ascended to godhood, and then that of Ulrich, the wolf god, a far older, more traditional deity that Sigmar himself worshipped in life. The Empire is divided between worshipping both of these gods alongside some others that are much more minor by comparison. Sigmar is more popular than Ulrich, but Ulrich remains steadfastly popular in certain places, including Middenheim, which is the city from which that Boris Todbringer guy comes from. Mr. Todbringer has brought a great deal of his Ulrich-worshipping supporters into the Sigmar-worshipping city of Altdorf, and trouble is brewing. Karl himself is ambushed by a set of Middenlanders in the streets, and tensions are threatening to boil over into a full-blown riot, the last thing the city needs in the interregnum between emperors. Seeing the mess of arguing people, Karl steps forward. The Count of Nordland, who he's with, warns him against doing so, and he says that they're unguarded and unarmed. But Karl Franz just says, "Did Sigmar have guards?" before marching into the crowd anyway. He then does this. Franz looked at the crowd, and they looked back with anger and fear. They were broken, scared of the future. For the first time above all others, he knew he must be emperor. Mankind needed certainty to survive, or else chaos would skulk through the fractures of insecurity and bring ruin. "I am like you," he shouted. The crowd looked back, hostile. What did this southern prince know of them, of their lives? Franz steeled himself. "I am like you," he repeated with conviction. "I am but a man in a world of terrors. I do not speak for Ulrich. I have never worshipped the god of winter or wolves." The Ulrichans in the audience grew anxious at this. They knew Karl Franz didn't represent them, and yet saying it out loud made them even more uneasy. "I do not speak for Sigmar either," continued Franz. "Even the Grand Theogenist has made that point. I cannot remember the last temple service I attended." Some in the crowd tittered at that admission. "I may not recall all the psalms and battle hymns, but what I do know of these holy beings is that they are both warrior gods." The crowd began to lift. "I know that they fight for mankind, that they are both dedicated to our survival. Why should Sigmarite and Ulrican tear each other apart when there are so many enemies at our borders, all too willing to fall on Empire steel?" The cheers rose in volume. "Sigmar was a warrior in life. He worshipped Ulrich as a mortal man, and so we of Sigmar's creed must do the same. It is right we honor Ulrich. It is right we adulate Sigmar Heldenhammer, for only together can we overcome the darkness and bring order. We must unite, for the god of battle and winter's fangs, for the Heldenhammer." Bravery doesn't just mean charging into battle. Often, bravery is more pronounced in situations where turning and running away would be pretty easy. This situation wasn't life or death. It wasn't a be brave or perish in a literal heat of the moment sense. It was a be brave or watch your home perish. And so rather than seek guards or find another way around or otherwise do anything other than what he did, Karl united his people with that short speech. And that is leading by example, and that is the bravery of a hero. But that brings us to the next attribute, Part 2, Hero as Mighty. This one can also be called Hero as Capable. And that is an important secondary definition, as the founding hero of the modern fantasy genre, Frodo Baggins, is not exactly a mighty character. He isn't a legendary warrior like Gimli or Legolas. He isn't a powerful wizard like Gandalf. But he's courageous, and he is capable. And one of the main reasons he even is what he is, a little hobbit guy, is because Tolkien wanted to show his audience that heroes can come from the most humble and unassuming of backgrounds. And so, hero as mighty or hero as capable are both suitable definitions here. Hero as clever is another good flavor to aim for, as when written well, clever characters are some of the absolute most fun people to follow. Much like Sherlock Holmes or our favorite Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot. In either case, some form of competence is a key factor. The reasoning, as you might expect, is relatively simple. If your hero is not capable, they are either going to fail, which is unsatisfying, generally, or they are going to bumble their way into success, which, with the exception of comedy stories, is also unsatisfying. Thus, your heroes should be capable and in specific ways. Obviously, they shouldn't be good at everything or they become boring, but give them weaknesses, give them strengths, and foreshadow both. As a sort of random example, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty actually is a really good, fun little movie to watch if you want a clean, concise example of a film that pretty much sets up every important thing that happens and just knocks them over like dominoes. It's a really good study in storytelling that is worth your time as something to sort of think about in a meta sense while you watch it. But On to our main topic, our favorite prince and emperor. His competence is established in a variety of fields. He's a Warhammer character and one with a model you can use, even though mine isn't painted particularly well. So he's obviously a good fighter, despite being entirely a conventional human, which makes him something of a standout in a universe of unaging elves, dinosaur people, and everyone's favorite devious rat men. His equipment is pretty legendary. Black Gromril armor, the Silver Seal, and of course Galmaraz itself, the Warhammer that the settings were named for. But under all that, he's just a guy, and he regularly still bodies enemies much more powerful than himself. But this isn't the aspect of his capability that I find the most interesting, at least not relative to the setting that he's in. If I wanted a superlative warrior, there are plenty of other places to look in Warhammer Fantasy. Malice Darkblade, Gotrek Gurnison, and Grimgor Ironhide are all examples of characters who would almost certainly slaughter Karl Franz in a 1v1. But what he has that they don't is that he is a master statesman. This is best exemplified by how he actually secures his position as emperor. As indicated earlier, he had sort of an uphill battle. He wasn't really willing at first and was up against a capable, powerful, and intimidating opponent in Boris Todbringer. Yet, all in the span of around a day, he manages to secure almost everybody's vote. It starts with him sitting in a pub with his good friend Maximilian, the Count of Ostland, when the Mad Count of Averland and the Elder of the Halflings enter. The Mad Count already supports Karl, and he's also just really funny. But the Halfling is much more suspicious, and reasonably so, as the Halflings are treated so poorly by everyone in Warhammer that even the writers hate them. But what the Halfling Elder wants is for trade to be diverted into his lands so he can collect tariffs. Karl agrees, and decides to levy a tax on traffic passing through a river in the province of Ostermark. His compatriots tell him he'll basically be trading Ostermark's vote for the Halfling's vote, but Franz isn't worried. Next he moves to the Count of Stirland. All you need to know about Stirland is that it sucks. Anyway, they have a bit of an undead problem, so Franz secures his vote by promising aid on that front and sweetening the deal by mentioning that the river tax will divert trade into Stirland as well, for their benefit. But then comes that Count of Ostermark that place's tax would theoretically be screwing over. This Count is obviously pretty pissed off with Karl, but our boy still isn't worried. He tells this Count that he's going to base the severity of the tax on proximity to the capital city. And since Ostermark is pretty far away from the capital, they won't be taking the lion's share of the burden from the tax, giving them a competitive advantage over their main rival, a place I haven't mentioned yet called Talabikland. With that and Franz's earlier deals, ensuring Talabikland will assist Ostermark with troubles on the border, he's pretty much finished securing that vote. The only ones left then are those of the Sigmarite Church, which he snags with that speech from earlier. And thus Karl wins every single vote, including that from his own rival, except for one, that Maximilian guy I mentioned earlier, the Count of Ostland. And that turned out to not actually be Maximilian, but some chaos-aligned assassin, so he doesn't even count. Thus, Karl Franz proves that he is capable, not only strong, but clever as well. This is true while he also doesn't feel over-favored or unfairly powerful. Because of the rules of the setting, we know there are things he can't do in matchups he would not win. And yet, even in such scenarios, we know he'd fight anyway because he is brave, because he is competent, and because he is, Part 3, hero as good. Considering the specific topic of our conversation here, we're talking about honest-to-God heroes as opposed to anti-heroes or morally gray characters. One of the defining traits of heroism is goodness. We all, to some extent, inherently understand what sorts of traits to expect in this field. Selflessness, generosity, kindness, all that sort of thing. Someone who does the right thing even when it's hard. However, I don't personally believe that heroes need to be extremely one-note on this topic, and there can be a lot more nuance to it without them quite slipping into the territory of anti-hero or morally gray. And that, put simply, is because nobody's perfect. There are vanishingly few, if any, people who have ever lived that never did anything wrong. I'm not saying everybody's done something horrible, but at some point or another in our weakest or darkest of moments, everyone screws up eventually. Heroes tend to do this as well. It's by no means uncommon for heroes to do bad things occasionally, but it is the ends for which such things happen in your story that I'm concerned with here. In general, you'll have to be much more careful in determining how and why your character does something wrong, as opposed to when they do things right, given that the former is deviating from their baseline behavior. If our hero spends all his free time saving cats from trees, another scene of him saving a cat from a tree will not really stand out, and may even become obnoxious or boring if done too much or without specific purpose each time. That same character later snapping after being irritated in a social situation and slapping somebody is probably going to stand out pretty starkly against their other actions. And that is more true than if you have an anti-hero or a morally gray character. With those, both good and bad actions are sort of to be expected at that point. But when your generally good character does do something wrong, it'll stand out a lot more. In any case, relating this principle to Karl Franz, we know he is fundamentally good because he takes on his position as emperor out of a sense of responsibility to his people and to humanity itself. He easily could have stepped aside and lived a life of luxury. He lives in the biggest, richest city in the land and is part of one of the wealthiest of its families. He could easily have screwed off to some estate somewhere and never had to do anything difficult ever again. Instead, he does the harder thing because he knows it will be better for all those around him. Rule is a terrible burden, he is told, but it is a burden he is willing to carry. And yet, he isn't some sort of goody two-shoes either, which is something you also probably want to avoid for your own heroes. Karl drinks, he goes out to pubs, he's sort of irresponsible, doesn't attend the religious services he's expected to, and all that sort of thing. In my Writing Morally Gray Characters video, Karl Franz would be a character A type, one with superficial evils. With morally gray characters, you do want them to have some substantial evils. But with heroes, superficial evils, that is to say, things that one might disapprove of but would not, if they were reasonable, hate somebody for, can be of great use. They add a bit of nuance to make your character feel a lot more like a real person. Everyone has their own vices, so to speak, and giving your hero some, even if they aren't hugely emphasized, will significantly help in making them feel real. However, for the last of our heroic traits, we're going to be taking a bit of a different direction. Part 4. Hero as Flawed. We were just on the topic of not wanting perfectly pure characters, and here's where we come to a related topic. I've mentioned it here and there already, that you don't want to overpower your heroes, that they should have vices and that sort of thing, but more than that, even if it isn't any type of moral failing, they need flaws. Frodo Baggins is not a standout fighter, and he's tempted by the power of the One Ring. Luke Skywalker is impulsive and quick to anger. These are all traits that cause problems for the characters they're attached to, but they are all necessary to making a whole character. A flawless hero isn't a character, they're a propaganda piece. People have thrown around the term Mary Sue to the point that it really doesn't mean anything anymore, but the actual definition of that term has something of a point. If everyone likes your character all the time and they're good at everything, they're gonna end up being disliked by someone, alright, and that someone will be your audience. Ultimately, I would argue that flaws are just as, if not more important than your character's virtues. We expect heroes to be virtuous, to be capable and brave and good, and that's why I was just talking about those traits, but we don't always expect what their flaw turns out to be, and yet we need them to have one all the same. So, on to Karl Franz. His flaws are on a mechanical level that he just isn't going to win a lot of his fights, because, as said earlier, at the end of the day, he's only human. But that's more of a rule of the universe than a flaw with him, so I don't think it counts. Instead, his flaws are that he was selfish and denied his own duties. As his well-mustached friend and personal bodyguard, Kurt Helborg says, "Those that seek power think it will make their span easier. But from what you saw in your father, it is a terrible burden. No wonder you do not want it. But that is the selfish route. Yes, you may have time for your family and the riches of the Holzwig-Schlestein estate, but that would be a great waste of your skills considering what lies on the horizon." And this was the reason Karl essentially denied his duty for most of his life. Bear in mind, he's in his early 30s by the time he actually takes this whole "I might be the emperor" thing seriously. Hell, it's practically on one day that he makes this decision. Of course, he overcomes this personal flaw, but even in his reign, his flaw is that he's essentially willing to manipulate others around him to his own ends. They may be pretty good ends, but it doesn't change the fact that he's willing to use dishonest tactics and schemes to achieve them. And now I can tell you all of this was pulled essentially from one short story called The Prince of Altdorf, and it's all consistent with how Karl Franz tends to be depicted in other sources, but I kept it focused there simply because it demonstrates how you can thoroughly make a well-rounded hero even in the runtime of a short story. I'd also just highly recommend you read it. It's free and can be found just by Googling it. With that, I think we've discussed writing heroes and how Karl Franz is a dang good one. If you have any thoughts of your own about writing heroes or about Prince and Emperor Karl Franz himself, let me know about them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, every single like and subscription go a really long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we have a Patreon and channel memberships, all linked in the description below. I've also got to thank Shadowrunner, our $10 patron, and a Knight of the Inner Circle. And remember, when in doubt,
Summon the Elector Counts!